We continue now at the top of Daf Tazayin Amud Aleph and Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 16a. On the previous summit, the Mishnah said that a Zor, if a non-Kohen, does Avod in the Beis HaMikdash, does the Avod of a Korban in the Beis HaMikdash, that Korban is disqualified. And the Gemara asks, what's the source for that? And the Gemara now is in the middle of bringing the source from Devei Rabbi Yishmael, who learn a Kal V'chomer from a Baal Mum, a Kohen who's a Baal Mum. If a Kohen who's a Baal Mum, if he does the Avod, if that disqualifies the Korban, so Zor, when it comes to a non-Kohen, She'eno Ochel, he doesn't eat. Rashi says, Zor She'eno Ochel B'Kod She'Kodshim. He's not allowed, he cannot eat Karbonos that are Kod She'Kodshim like a Baal Mum is able to. So Eino Din Shem Avad Chilal. Isn't it logical to say that if he does the Avod in the Beis HaMikdash, he profanes that Avod? But the Gemara says, Mala Baal Mum, but what's unique about a Baal Mum, Shekein Asabo Karev Kemakriv, the halacha of the one bringing the Karban is the same as the Karban itself. Rashi explains, Shekein Asabo Karev Kemakriv, it means Hamum Posel Bekarban, the Karev, that Karban which is brought, if there's a mum, if there's a blemish on the animal, that's a disqualification. Kiderach Sheposel Bekohen, in the same way that it disqualifies the Kohen. So mum is unique because it applies not only to the Kohen, but it applies to the animal as well, and so therefore you can't learn Zar from Baal Mum. And the Gemara continues, Tamei Yochiach, well, a Tamei who's not allowed to do the Avodah, he can prove the other way. Rashi explains, Tamei Yochiach Shelo Asabo Karev Kemakriv. There, we don't say that the animal is the same as the Kohen. She'ein behema mekabelas tuma mechaim, because an animal is not mekabel tuma when it's alive. Kishem shah Kohen tamei mechaim, in the same way that a Kohen is tamei when he's alive. Uchsiv v'yinazru, and it says it's written in the pasuk v'yinazru, which is the pasuk brought on the previous summon. V'lo yechalalu. It says they have to separate from tuma. They can't profane the avoda. Alma. So we see tamei sha'avad chila, that if a tamei Kohen does the avoda, that profanes the avoda, and it disqualifies, and so therefore Tamei can prove the other way. But the Gemara says, Ma'ala Tamei Shekein Matame, but what's unique about someone who's Tamei? He can be Matame others, and so therefore that's not the same as a Zor, as a non-Kohen. And the Gemara says, Baal Mum Yochiach, well, Baal Mum can prove the other way, V'chazar Hadin, and it goes back and forth. Lo Roizeh Karoizeh, V'lo Roizeh Karoizeh, this is not like this one, and that one's not like that, and that one's not like this one. Hatzad HaShaveh Shabahen, the common denominator between Baal Mum and Tamei, Shemuz Haran, is that there is a warning, V'yim Avdu Chilalo, and if they do the Avod, it profanes the Avod, it's disqualified. Af Ani Avizar, so too I can include a non-Kohen, Shehum Muzar, that he is warned, V'yim Avad Chilal, and if he does the Avod, that's going to be profaned, it will be disqualified. Rashi explains Shemusharin that they are warned Shalo Lavo Tamei Mi V'Yinazru. The pasuk of V'Yinazru was a warning not to do the Avod Tamei. And Baal Mum Mi V'Lo Yigash. The Baal Mum also there's a warning from V'Lo Yigash, and so therefore again we include Zar as well, where there's a warning. Therefore, if he does the Avoda, it is disqualified. And the Gemara continues, Menolan to Muzhar, from where do we know that a Zar is warned? Rashi has the Girsa, Heicha Muzhar, Muzhar Zar, where is a Zar warned? And Imi V'Yinazru, if you're going to say it's from the pasuk of V'Yinazru, Chilul Begufe Ksiv Bey, it actually says Chilul, that it's profaned in that pasuk itself. That was actually the other opinion in the Gemara in the previous Amud. The Talmud of Rabbi Yishmael is learning from the Kal V'chomer, but the other opinion on the previous Amud was to learn the source, that if a Zar does the Avodah, that it's disqualified from V'Yinazru. And so the point is, if you're learning the warning from V'Yinazru, you can learn the whole thing from V'Yinazru. The whole point is the Talmud of Rabbi Yishmael doesn't agree to learn from that pasuk of V'Yinazru. Rashi says, Inema mi V'Yinazru darash le lahai kra. If you're darshaning the pasuk of V'Yinazru that B'nei Yisrael lahazir zarim kadamar la'el, that same drasha that we had before, that it's a warning for the non-Kohanim, so chilul begufei ksiv. Then it says the word chilul in that pasuk, the kal v'chomer lamalach, and you wouldn't need a kal v'chomer. And so therefore, instead, the Gemara says, Ella, rather, the warning for a Zar is mi v'zar lo yikrav aleichem. It says that a Zar cannot come close to you. But the Gemara continues, can you really learn Zar from the combination of Baal Mum and Tamei? Mal hatzad hashavah shebehen, because the common denominator, there's a different common denominator of Baal Mum and Tamei. Shekein lo hutru b'bama, because both of those are not permitted by a bama, by a private individual's altar. And Rashi explains, Mal hatzad shekein lo hutru b'bama b'bamas yochad. Again, we're talking about an individual's altar, b'shas heter habamos, during the time when bamos were permitted. To Tanan b'perak b'asr, because we learned in the Mishnah in the last parak, hazman v'hanosr v'hatamei shavin bazeh uvazeh, that zman and nosr and tamei, and so there's tamei listed over there. They're the same by bama katana and bama gadola. Ubebraisa tanya Allah, and the Braisa it says over there, dvarim sheshavsa bama katana lebama gadola. These are all rules that are the same by a bama katana and a bama gadola. Dam matir, that the blood matirs, umafagil, and there's pigul, umumin and blemishes. Tomar bizar, whereas by zar shekasher b'bama, zar actually is allowed to bring the karban on a bama. So in other words, the mumin which is listed over here, tamei Tameh, which is listed over here, those are the same halachas by a bama. That's not true by a zar. Kedetanan hasam, like we learned in the Mishnah over there. Elu devarim shebein bama gedola bama katana. These are the differences between a bama gedola, great bama, and a bama katana. V'katani hasam kiyun u bigdei shares, and it says over there kiyun and bigdei shares. So kahuna is mentioned over there, meaning a zar is permitted. Ukroi nami muchi, and also the psukim show that begidon u manoach u shmuel sheikrivu b'bama. We have examples Gidon, Manoach, Shmuel that brought karbanos on a bama, and so therefore you shouldn't be able to learn out zar again from the cases of Tameh and Balmum. And so the Gemara continues and says, Lo tema Tameh yochiach. Don't say that Tameh will prove the other way. We're not learning from the combination of Balmum and Tameh. Ela ema onen yochiach. Rather, you can say that onen will prove the other way, and onen also, if he does the avoda is disqualified. Rashi says, Onen yalfinan lekamon mikroi. We're going to learn later on from Sukkim him avad chilal. If he does the avoda, then it is profaned, it is disqualified. So onen will prove the other way. Mala onen, but what's unique about an onen, shekena aser b'maiser, that he's aser and maiser. Balmum yochiach, Balmum can prove the other way. He's not aser and maiser. V'chazar, then again it goes back and forth. Lo roizeh k'roizeh. This one is not like this one. Hatzar ha'shavah shebehen, the common denominator, the same as above. Shem muzharin v'chulu, that they're warned, and again the avodah is disqualified. And so the same thing is true when it comes to the case of a zar. And Rashi explains, shekein aser b'maiser, and onen is aser and maiser. Techsiv lo achalti ba'oni. It says that I didn't eat the maiser ba'oni, and that's a reference to Meiser Sheni. And Rashi continues, Onen muzar shelo yavod, and Onen, there is a warning not to serve. Dechsib b'kohen gadol, it says by the kohen gadol, Omin ha-mikdash lo yetzei v'lo yichal, it says he doesn't leave the mikdash and he doesn't profane. Ha-acher shelo yatzachil, but if somebody else doesn't leave the mikdash, it is profane. That's only true by a kohen gadol, but a regular Onen is going to be disqualified. But the Gemara continues and asks, Hachanami over here also, Lifroch, we can ask the same question as above. Mal hatzar hashavish behen shekain lo hutra b'bama. What is the common denominator now between Onin and Balmum that they are not permitted by a bama? But the Gemara continues, Maske Flor, if Sama Berei Derava, if Sama Berei Derava asks, Uman Leimalan, but who says the Onen Aser B'bama? How do we know that an Onen is prohibited in a bama? Dil Mashari B'bama, maybe he's permitted in a bama. Rashi says, Dil Mashari B'bama, Degabe Onen Ksiv, Umin HaMikdash, because by the Onen, specifically it talks about the Beis HaMikdash, so maybe a bama is permitted. And the Gemara continues with another source that a zar, a non-Kohen who does the avoda, that it's disqualified. Rav Misharshi Yomar, and Misharshi says, Asya kal v'chomer mi Yoshev, we can make a kal v'chomer from a Kohen who is sitting. Ma Yoshev, when a Kohen is sitting down, sha'ochel, that he's able to eat from kodshei kodshim, im avar chilal, but if he's sitting down when he does the avoda, it's profaned, it's disqualified. So zar, a non-Kohen, she'eno ochel, who doesn't eat from kodshei kodshim, and din shim avar chilal, isn't it logical to say that if he does the avoda, it is profaned, it's disqualified? But the Gemara says, Mali Yoshev shekain pasal le'edus, but Yoshev is unique because somebody cannot be an aid, he cannot be a witness, he cannot testify when he's sitting down, so we can't learn out from Yoshev. So the Gemara says, well, mi Yoshev Talmud Chacham, we can learn from a Talmud Chacham who's sitting, because the Talmud Chacham is able to testify sitting down. But still the Gemara asks, Ma l'shem Yoshev, but in general sitting down, shekain pasal le'edus, that in general sitting down is a disqualification from edus, even though there are exceptions. The Gemara says, Shem Yoshev lo parach, we don't ask questions from Yoshev from sitting in general, so we can still learn out from Yoshev Talmud Chacham. The Gemara says, V'im Tim Solomon, now if you're going to say parach that we can ask a question from Shem Yoshev, As Yami Yoshev u'mechada mehanach. We could just learn out a tzad hashava from Yoshev and from one of the other sources we had above. And the Gemara continues and says, if that's the case, then it must be that Yoshev is kosher by a bama, because if Yoshev is not kosher by a bama, then the tzad hashava won't work, because you'll say both of these cases are going to be prohibited by a bama. So the Gemara asks, V'Yoshev the kosher b'bama minol, and from where do we know that a Yoshev, that a Kohen sitting down, that's permissible by the bama? It's permissible rather to do the avoda when sitting down by a bama. Amar Kra, the pasuk says, Lamod lifnei Hashem l'shar, so it says to stand before Hashem. It says lifnei Hashem, means before Hashem. V'lo lifnei bama, not in front of a bama. When it comes to bama, Yoshev is okay. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said onen, that if an onen, someone in acute mourning, that's again when a close relative dies and hasn't been buried yet, that is the state of being an onen. And onen, if he does the avoda is disqualified. The Gemara says, Minolim, from where do we know this? Tichsiv, because it's written in the pasuk by Kohen Gadol, it says, Umin ha-mikdash lo yetzei v'lo yichal, it says from the mikdash he doesn't leave and he doesn't profane. Ha-acher shelo yetzei, so it sounds like somebody else who doesn't leave the mikdash, chilel, he does profane, meaning there's an exception by a Kohen Gadol, but by a regular Kohen, he cannot do the avoda when he is an onen. Rashi explains, Onin menolan depasul, from where do we know an Onin is disqualified? Kediktani masnisim, like the Mishnah says. It says in the pasuk, U'min mikdash le'el minei ksiv. Earlier in this pasuk it's written, Li'avevu limo lo yitama, he shouldn't become tamei to his father and his mother. Uve kohen gadol mishtah, it's saying a kohen gadol should not become tamei even to his close relatives, like his father and his mother. V'samach le'o min mikdash, and then it says this pasuk nearby that he can't leave the mikdash, meaning he continues the avoda. Kilomar means to say, Af b'yom shemesu avev v'imo, even on the day that his father and mother die, ein tzarech lotzis min mikdash, he doesn't need to leave the mikdash. Ela omedu makrev, rather he stands and he offers karbanos v'lo yechalel, and it will not profane the karbanos. She'ein hakadshim eschalin bekach. The karbanos will not be profaned; they will not be disqualified with this service of the kohen gadol as an onen. So we can infer ha'hedyot shelo yatsa v'avad chilel. It sounds like if a hedyot, a regular kohen, doesn't leave the mikdash and he does the avoda, that in fact will profane the avoda. So again, the source essentially comes from an inference from kohen gadol. And the Gemara continues with another source. Rabbi Lazar Amar Mehacha. Rabbi Lazar says it comes from here, from the following pasuk. This is by Nadav and Avihu. It says, Hein hikrivu, ani hikrafti. They brought, I brought. Mechlal, the implication of this pasuk is, the inu akriv, that if they did offer a carbon, shapir estarif, would make sense that the carbon should be burned. Rashi explains, Hein hikrivu, Hein hayom hikrivu, today the karbonos were offered, and the point over here is as follows. Mitshuvaso shal Aaron, from the response of Aaron, atolomid, we learn, ma omar lo Moshe, we can understand what Moshe said to Aaron from the way that Aaron is responding. Madua lo achaltem, the question was, why didn't you eat? Meaning, Shema banecha hikrivua ba'aninos, meaning, maybe your sons brought the carbon and they were owning him. Shall you own him al Nadav Avihu, because your other sons, they were owning him on the death of Nadav and Avihu. Upsalti, and so therefore it became disqualified, and that's why it was burned. That's what was going on in this conversation. Moshe was saying to Aaron, maybe the reason why the carbon was disqualified was because of Aninos. Amar lo Aaron said to him, V'chi hein hikrivu, did they bring the carbon? That's the reference in the Gemara of hein hikrivu, did they bring the carbon? V'alo hedioto saying, but they're regular kohanim, upsulan li'avod, and they're disqualified from doing the avoda. Ani crafty, I offered it. Shamartali v'yasas carbon because again the pasuk says that he should do the carbon. V'ani kohen gadol, and I'm a kohen gadol, u'makravonin, and I do bring karbonos when I'm an onin. Mechlal, and so the implication of this whole conversation is the inu akrav, that if they had brought it to shaper estarif, then it makes sense that it would be burned. V'lohaya Moshe omer lehem madua lo achaltem, and then Moshe, he would not have said to them, why didn't you eat? And so therefore that's the implication we can draw from this pasuk. And the Gemara continues, Rebbe Lazar my time lo amar mi umin hamikdash lo yetze. Why does Rebbe Lazar learn from that first source, min hamikdash lo yetze by kohen gadol? Amar lach, he'll say to you, miksiv ha'acher shelo yatzachil. Does it say in that pasuk that if somebody else doesn't leave the mikdash, it's profane? That was just an inference. You can't learn from the inference. V'idach, and the other one, my time lo amar mi hein hikrivu, the one who learns from umin hamikdash lo yetze. Why doesn't he learn from these psukim in the context of the death of Nadav and Avihu? And the Gemara answers to that, because he holds mipnei tuma nisrafa. That's not exactly what happened in the story. The real reason why it was burned, why the carbon was burned, was because of tuma. And Rashi explains, miksiv ha'acher, does it say that if a regular Kohen would serve, it would be profaned? Dilma acher nami lo chila. Maybe if a Kohen had yot served, it also would not be profaned. And maybe uvididei itztrichle. Maybe we need to teach by a Kohen gadol lemesharia. We're saying that a Kohen gadol is allowed to do the avoda. Delo tema, because you shouldn't say mitoch cheshuva, because he's so important, he's the Kohen gadol. Uktushoso yiseru. Maybe you'll say because he has an extra kedusha, pasal onin, that we should say the onin is disqualified. So maybe the pasuk is simply saying a Kohen gadol is permitted, but it's not necessarily saying that it's prohibited by a regular Kohen. And then the Gemara says, Kasavram ibnei Tumah, the other opinion holds in terms of what happened with the story by the death of Nadav and Avihu, that the carbon was burned because of Tumah. Shenagaba, meaning Tumah touched it. Nisrafa, that's why it was burned. V'lo huskar sham aninos linyan hakrava. Aninos is not mentioned there as far as bringing the offering. V'hein hikrivu hachikamar, when it says in the pasuk hein hikrivu, it means as follows. Hein hayom halo adayin yomhu. It means it's today, it's still day. V'hayinu asurin bekachim lechol ad erev. We can't eat the kachim until evening. Umitoch kach iraba Tumah bionus, and that's why Tumah happened bionus by accident. And Rashi continues, V'ika tanoi de pligi lekamon baha. There's actually machlokas tanoim about this issue later on. Chad amram mipnei Tumah nisrafa. One says it was burned because of Tumah. V'chad amram mipnei aninos nisrafa. One says it's because of aninos that it was burned. Shelo hayu yecholin laochla afilu laerev, that they weren't able to eat it even in the evening. To kasavar aninos laila nami aser, because that opinion holds that aninos at night light is even prohibited. V'afilu nikva hameis, even if the dead body has already been buried. Well, official lo hayu la ochlin, and because there was no one to eat it anymore, nisrafa was burned. Uchid Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka damar b'psachim. That follows Rabbi Yochanan ben Broka in Meseches Psachim. Gabe nitmu bailam shel Pesach. By the case where the owners of the Pesach become tamei, avzei yisaref miyad, it should be burned immediately. She'ein lo ochlin, because there's no one to eat it. Vein toni burtzura, you don't have to wait until its form has diminished. And the Gemara continues with another source for onein. Devei Rabbi Yishmael tan in the yeshiva Rabbi Yishmael was taught asi b'kal v'chomer mi bal mum. We can learn onein a kal v'chomer from bal mum. Uma, and just like we find, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Tazayin Amid Beis.